New Mexico Territory. Spring 1873. Miles upon miles of scorched earth stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun. A freight locomotive rumbled across the barren landscape, its steel wheels grinding against iron rails. Echoing like rattling skeletons across the wasteland, the final passenger compartment held stale air thick with dust particles and defeat. Men sat motionless, hats pulled over their faces, weathered boots caked in grime, their hollow eyes reflecting lives spent in a territory that gave nothing back. In the rear corner sat an isolated figure, Silas Boone, imposing and silent. His weathered tan duster, worn but sturdy, draped around him like protective armor against sandstorms and gunfire. Beneath his hat brim, a weathered, angular face remained fixed on the landscape beyond the glass. His eyes, expressionless and distant, seemed to belong to someone who'd abandoned hope long ago. Since boarding, he'd remained wordless, and no passenger dared approach him. Then the compartment door screeched open. A young woman entered, no older than 18, her hair tangled by wind, dirt smeared across her face. Her torn dress hung loosely, too delicate for the harsh desert climate. Oversized boots, clearly borrowed, scraped the splintered floorboards with dragging laces. Her breathing came rapid and shallow, her gaze constantly darting backward. Those desperate, frantic eyes swept the car before settling on the solitary man in back. She approached him, gripping a canvas bag against her chest like a drowning person clutching driftwood. Reaching his seat, she stopped. "Sir?" she breathed, nearly inaudible, her voice fractured with terror. "Could you let me hide under your coat?" Silas remained motionless initially. Then slowly, deliberately, his head turned. Their eyes connected. Hers were bloodshot and wide, yet not defeated. A spark of resistance flickered beneath the dust in desperation. "Please," her whisper came again. "Don't let them find me." Silas blinked deliberately, his jaw tensing. Then wordlessly, he shifted his broad shoulders and lifted his coat's edge. She slipped beside him, trembling violently. Her small frame curled beneath the heavy fabric, her shoulder touching his ribs. Not a word passed between them. Her panicked breathing gradually slowed to match the train's rhythmic sway. Eyes closing, she clutched the satchel in her lap with shaking hands. Silas continued staring ahead, expression unchanged. The train rocked gently along the tracks. Beyond the window, sunlight descended behind distant hills, casting amber beams through the dusty glass, then dashed footsteps. Multiple pairs, heavy and purposeful, growing louder, drawing nearer. Somewhere along the corridor, a door crashed open. Boots echoed closer, the footfalls intensified. Wood groaned under heavy heels. Ellie's breath seized. She pressed tighter against Silas, concealed beneath his coat like prey hiding from predators. Her broken whisper emerged. "Please don't let them catch me." "I'm begging." Silas stayed silent. But he adjusted slightly, his expansive coat folding closer around her. He didn't glance down. He asked nothing. Yet the gesture conveyed everything words couldn't. "You're under my protection now," the door groaned. Boots entered. 3 figures, one lanky and sun-damaged, another thick-set with gambler's rings on every finger. The third bore a scar slashing across his chin like a blade mark. They moved deliberately, scrutinizing faces with predatory hunger. One actually sniffed the air like a tracking hound. Ellie's nails dug into her bag, body quaking, lips pressed shut to suppress a whimper. One man pivoted, staring directly toward the rear bench straight at Silas. His stare lingered. Silas returned it unflinching, expression like carved granite. No reaction, no fear. The man hesitated, uncertain, then turned away. They continued forward. Ellie's chest loosened slightly until the train lurched. Desert wind slammed the windows, carrying a muffled but sharp voice from outside. "She's aboard this train." "Keep searching." One pursuer doubled back, hand reaching toward the rear seat. Silas moved instantly. Without warning, he stood, his towering frame expanding, coat billowing like a storm cloud, and seized Ellie's wrist. "Hold tight," he commanded. He yanked her upward and bolted toward the car's rear. The emergency exit? The escape hatch? What the... Hey. One man bellowed. Silas kicked the latch. The door exploded outward, wind howling through the opening. Ellie gasped, boots sliding on the threshold. "Jump," he said. Before she could scream, he leaped first, pulling her with him. They struck earth violently, tumbling through sand and dry scrub. The world spun wildly. Ellie felt skin tear on her elbow. Sharp rocks bit her knee. Silas rolled upright and hauled her to her feet wordlessly. The locomotive thundered away behind them, wheels shrieking into the distance. Then came the shouts. They jumped. Over the ridge. Silas grabbed Ellie's hand and ran. They pushed through brittle weeds and jagged stone, climbing toward a parched ravine. The descending sun cast fiery streaks across the terrain. Ellie stumbled. Silas didn't pause, just reached back, jerked her upright, and kept moving. They reached a shallow canyon's edge, and Silas pulled her behind a formation of crimson stone. Crouching, he retrieved a knife from his boot and sliced rope from his belt. Then he gathered dry grass, twisting it with practiced efficiency. "What are you doing?" Ellie gasped, crouching beside him. He didn't look up. "Creating a diversion." He secured rope to a scrub branch, ignited the grass with flint, and shoved it beneath accumulated dry brush. White smoke billowed rapidly, swirling around the rocks like desert fog. "This way." "Back here." He pulled her low through undergrowth, weaving between boulders until they dropped into a narrow, waterless creek bed. Behind them, voices cursed and coughed in confusion. "What's with all this smoke?" "Which direction?" Ellie followed blindly, lungs burning with exertion. Her legs screamed for rest, but stopping wasn't an option. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the shouting faded. Silas slowed. Silence returned, just wind, twilight, and her ragged breathing. She collapsed to her knees. "I can't go on." "You can," he said, looking down at her with something almost resembling kindness. Then he extended his hand. She accepted it. They walked again, slower now, over another ridge, through one final stretch of stubborn sagebrush, and then light. A single lantern flickered from a ramshackle house nestled in a shallow valley. The fences leaned but held. The barn showed gaps, yet the roof remained intact. Chickens wandered freely. A rusted bell dangled from a post. Ellie blinked in disbelief. "Is this?" Silas nodded simply. "My ranch." He led her across the yard, past a limping goat, toward the front steps. "You'll be protected here," he stated matter-of-factly. Then he opened the door. Dawn arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the old oak's branches near the porch, casting golden patterns across the yard. A gentle breeze stirred, warm against the ranch house's weathered planks. Ellie stepped outside barefoot, her dress hem brushing the earth. The morning air carried scents of hay, eggshell, and peaceful stillness. She didn't know if she should help, but her hands needed occupation. She began with the porch, sweeping dust and debris into a neat pile, then moved toward the barn, stacking kindling unbidden. Her fingers worked instinctively, eyes scanning everything as if memorizing safety's dimensions. A soft creak interrupted the silence. Tom emerged, no taller than the saddle he was meant to fetch. 6 years old, wild blonde hair, and a permanent dirt streak on his cheek. He blinked at her. "You ain't a ghost," he observed. Ellie smiled. "Not today. You're new here. Seems so." "I was new once, too. Then I stayed." He stepped out, dragging a coiled lead rope. "Mr. Boone lets me live here. He's not my father or nothing. He just found me in town when I had nowhere else." She crouched to his level. "Does he treat you well?" "Yep, better than the sheriff ever did. And he taught me how to whistle with grass." He handed her a grass blade and demonstrated, though his whistle emerged more like a breathy squeak. They spent the next hour together in the yard. Tom showed her egg collection without getting pecked. Ellie showed him rope braiding. When a hen burst from the coop, startling them both, they laughed until their sides ached. Later, Ellie carried a small basket of vegetables back to the kitchen. She rinsed them in a basin, sleeves rolled up, arms dusted with flour and earth. Her body moved on instinct. It felt like a life she'd nearly forgotten. Inside, Silas already sat at the table. Tom hopped up beside him with a thud. Ellie paused in the doorway, uncertain whether to sit. Silas nodded once toward the empty chair, so she took it. Breakfast was modest warm oats, a slice of dry cornbread, black coffee. Ellie noticed the details, the spoon placed neatly at her side, the napkin folded without creases. She whispered, "Thank you for what you did yesterday." Silas didn't look at her. "You needed assistance?" "That's not always reason enough for people to offer it." He didn't respond. They ate in silence, the kind that wasn't cold, just cautious. Tom hummed while kicking his heels against the chair leg. After breakfast, Silas went outside. Tom followed, dragging a wooden stick he'd declared a sword. Ellie stayed behind to clear dishes. As she rinsed a bowl, her voice slipped into the quiet. "I'm 18, she said, back to the room, though she knew she wasn't alone. "Not that it matters much. My father always claimed I was just old enough to be useful." She paused, hands submerged in water. "He drank most days, gambled the rest, lost more than money. Lost whatever kindness he'd possessed." A plate clinked gently in the tin sink. "When debts piled too high, he traded me to a saloon owner. Called it marriage, but it wasn't. The man was twice my age, maybe more. Always reeked of blood and whiskey." She swallowed hard. "The night before the ceremony, I took the ring. Some coins. I ran." Her voice dropped. "They've been hunting me since." The dish slipped in her grip, then steadied. Behind her, a chair scraped back. A quiet step. Silas appeared beside her, took a towel, and began drying plates. He said nothing. She didn't look at him, but her voice softened. "I didn't think I'd survive past the train." "Then you—" She trailed off. Silas folded the towel with practiced hands. Outside, Tom shouted something about sword fighting a cactus. His voice echoed across the yard. Ellie turned toward the window, and for the first time in days, she laughed, not forced, not polite, just genuinely laughed. Silas looked at her. Something in his eyes shifted. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it in a very long time. Days drifted past without incident, bringing with them the slow settling of silence that no longer felt tense, but resembled something closer to tranquility. Ellie fell into the ranch's rhythm as if she'd always belonged. Mornings began with soft, floorboard creaks and damp earth scent. She swept the porch, fetched water in small buckets, folded sun-warmed laundry. She chopped vegetables for stew or mended Tom's shirts where elbows had frayed from excessive imaginary sword fights with fence posts. Silas, true to his character, remained quiet, moving through each day like part of the landscape itself, dependable, solid, unspoken. He repaired corral posts systematically, patched the barn roof without complaint, and cleaned his tools with the same care he gave saddles in silence. Their words remained few, but something was beginning to fill the space between them, something slower than conversation and softer than certainty. One afternoon, when light had turned amber and long shadows stretched across the pasture, Ellie wandered to the fence line, her skirts catching in weeds, fingertips brushing wild grasses. There, nestled between two rocks, she spotted a small bloom-a-single wildflower with pale yellow petals and a trembling stem. It looked fragile, out of place in the dry soil, yet it survived. She plucked it gently and carried it back toward the house. Without a word, she placed it on the wooden step outside the front entrance. Nothing elaborate, nothing wrapped, just the bloom resting against sun-bleached grain. That evening, Silas found it. He stood for a long moment at the top of the stairs, staring down at the flower as if it had no business thriving here. Then he picked it up almost reluctantly and disappeared inside. Later, when Ellie passed the small writing desk tucked in the main room's corner, she noticed his old leather-bound notebook left open on the edge. Pressed neatly between two pages was the wildflower. Flattened but carefully preserved. She said nothing the next day. When Ellie walked by the stable bringing in the wash, she noticed a change in her usual resting spot, the flat stone beside the paddock where she often sat after chores. A folded piece of oiled hide had been laid across the stone like a cushion, and beside it sat a wooden cup filled with cool water, the rim still beaded with condensation. She paused. one hand on the laundry basket, and smiled. There were no names attached, no notes, no explanations. But the message was as clear as if it had been carved in oak. She sat for a while that afternoon, sipping the water, eyes watching the sky, that evening. As dusk crept across the porch and Stu's scent filled the kitchen, Ellie finished sewing the patch on Tom's shirt while Silas quietly repaired the gate that had been sagging all week. At dinner, without fanfare, Silas reached for the pot and ladled soup into her bowl first. Tom didn't notice, busy recounting how he'd seen a hawk the size of a bear in the field. But Ellie did. She didn't speak of it, but the gesture settled warm inside her chest. Later that night, wind picked up suddenly, rustling shutters and whispering through cabin wall cracks. Ellie, already in her room, heard footsteps outside her window. She peeked through the curtain. Silas stood on the back stoop, securing the window latch with rope. He tied it off with a neat knot, tugged it twice to check, and walked away. He never knocked, never spoke a word. Ellie returned to her bed, pulled the thin blanket tighter, and let the wind slide past without worry. Lying in darkness, her thoughts drifted. He doesn't speak much, but everything he does feels like a sentence he never voiced aloud. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand the language. The morning began ordinarily. Sunlight crept over the ridge, illuminating fence posts in gold. Ellie was hanging laundry behind the house, Tom's shirt sleeves dancing in the breeze. She hummed softly, a melody she could no longer name, while Tom chased a butterfly through the grass. Laughing and stumbling over his own feet, Silas was by the well, repairing a broken pulley, sleeves rolled up, forearms streaked with dirt and sweat. Ellie glanced over her shoulder, about to call out, then she froze. A plume of dust was rising beyond the hills, not the kind stirred by cattle or breeze. It was rapid, low, deliberate, and beneath it, figures on horseback. 3 of them as they crested the hill. The world seemed to narrow. Ellie's blood turned to ice. Her body moved before her mind caught up. "Silas!" she shouted, voice sharp. He stood and followed her gaze. The riders were closing in. It took only a heartbeat for him to understand. He dropped the rope, crossed the yard in wide strides, and grabbed Ellie by the wrist. "Get inside. Take Tom." But Tom was already running toward them, confused. "Who's that? Are they friends?" "No," Ellie said, scooping him into her arms. "No, sweetheart. Inside now." They barely made it through the door before the first man reached the porch. The second wasn't far behind. The third dismounted near the barn and vanished from view. The house shook as the door slammed shut. Silas pushed a cabinet in front of it and reached for the rifle leaning by the wall. "You remember what I taught you?" he said to Ellie, eyes locked. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Stay low. Stay calm." The door exploded inward. Wood splintered. One of the men, burly, sweat-soaked, eyes red with fury, charged in. Silas didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder into the man's gut, sending him crashing into the table. Ellie grabbed Tom and ducked behind the stove, shielding the boy with her body. The second man kicked in the back entrance. He grabbed at Ellie's skirt, snarling, but she flung a pot at his head, catching him square in the jaw. Silas turned, landing a punch that sent the attacker staggering into the wall. The house rang with noise grunts, wood cracking, glass shattering, then a scream. Not Ellie, Tom. The third man had crept in through the barn, circled around, and now stood in the kitchen doorway. His arm was wrapped around Tom's tiny chest. The blade of a hunting knife pressed against the boy's throat. Everything stopped. "Step back," the man growled. "Drop it or I'll spill the brat like a pig." Silas froze. Ellie's breath caught. Tom's eyes were wide, brimming with silent tears. Silas raised his hands slowly, the rifle slipping from his grip. "Don't hurt him. You don't want to do that." The man sneered. "I want the girl. She's got something that ain't hers, and I'm going to take it back. You'll get nothing if you touch the boy." The man's grin widened. "Then be a good hero, cowboy. Come take him back." Silas took a step forward, slow, deliberate. His voice softened. "Let him go. You're not leaving here if you don't." The man spat. "Neither are you." And just as Silas reached the table's edge, hands still raised, The third man swung the butt of his knife hard. Crack. The blow landed square at Silas's temple. He dropped like a felled tree, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Ellie screamed. Tom cried out. The knife dropped. Silas didn't move. His body lay still beside the hearth, blood beginning to pool beneath his cheek. The sound of Silas's body hitting the floor seemed to split reality in two. Ellie's scream tore through the room, raw and helpless. Tom kicked and squirmed in the outlaw's grip, small hands clawing against the man's arm. But the knife was already raised again. Ellie's eyes darted frantically across the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest, each beat louder than the last, until her gaze landed on the old hunting rifle propped by the fireplace. She moved before thinking. Her hands shook violently as she seized it, the weight nearly toppling her. The stock was worn smooth, the barrel cold. Her knees buckled, but she planted her feet. She could hear her own breath rasping, hear the outlaw's curse as he turned toward her. "Put that down, girl," he snarled, "or the boy dies first." Ellie's lips trembled, but her voice came out steady enough to surprise even herself. "Let him go, now." The door behind her creaked, and suddenly another presence filled the room. Old Raoul, the ranch hand who'd worked these fields since before. Silas was grown stepped inside with a shotgun cradled in his arms. His hair was gray and thin, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes burned like embers. "Best do as she says," Raoul growled. The room tensed, a taut string about to snap. Ellie raised the rifle higher, though her arms quivered beneath the strain, her finger brushing the trigger. The outlaw holding Tom sneered. "You wouldn't dare." Ellie swallowed, the barrel swaying. "Try me." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Raoul lifted his shotgun to the ceiling and fired. The explosion shook the rafters, dust cascading from the beams. The thunder of it rattled the dishes, and the outlaws flinched instinctively, eyes darting. "Next one aim for the roof," Raoul barked. Ellie drew in a ragged breath, braced the rifle against her shoulder, and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked, deafening. The bullet grazed the outlaw's shoulder, tearing fabric and skin. He howled, dropping Tom in shock. Tom scrambled across the floor and clung to Raoul's leg, sobbing. Ellie staggered back from the recoil, her arms burning, but she didn't drop the weapon. Her chest rose and fell with desperate fury, tears streaking her dust-smeared cheeks. She kept the barrel leveled even as her body shook. The outlaws glanced at each other, the sudden certainty in their eyes beginning to falter. One of them cursed, clutching the bleeding man by the arm. "She's crazy. Let's go." Another shot from Raoul split the air, this one grazing the porch as the men scrambled for the door. They stumbled into the yard, dragging their wounded comrade with them, spitting curses over their shoulders, but not daring to return. The sound of hooves pounded into the distance, and then silence. Ellie's grip slackened. The rifle slipped from her hands and clattered onto the floorboards. She collapsed to her knees beside Silas, whose still form lay sprawled on the kitchen planks, blood dark against the wood. "Silas," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Please wake up, please." No answer. Her tears dropped onto his shirt as her hands fumbled against his cheek, his chest, searching for any sign. "Don't you leave me," she begged, voice cracking. "You don't get to leave me after everything. Do you hear me?" A faint groan stirred from his throat. His body shifted, only barely, but it was enough. Ellie gasped with relief, clutching his hand in both of hers. Her heart thudded so wildly it drowned out the ringing in her ears. She pressed her forehead to his, whispering broken prayers and promises all at once. Tom sobbed into Raoul's coat, the old man rubbing his back with trembling hands, and Ellie, for the first time since she had run from the world, realized she wasn't running anymore. She was standing. Frightened, yes, her whole body shook with it, but still standing. Because someone she loved had fallen, and she had lifted the gun. The ranch fell into a hush after the chaos. The broken door was patched with rough boards. The yard still bore marks of hooves and scuffle, but inside the house the world had narrowed to a single room, a single bed, and the man who lay within it. Silas had not stirred much since the blow to his head. His breaths came slow, shallow at times, and Ellie counted each one as if the next might not come. She stayed by his side. She changed the damp cloth on his brow whenever it cooled. She coaxed water past his lips with a steady hand, her voice soft with words he could not quite hear. When Raoul brought broth from the stove, she lifted the spoon carefully, pressing it to his mouth. Whispering encouragement until he swallowed, Tom sat on the floor nearby, drawing with charcoal on scraps of paper, glancing up now and then with worried eyes. Ellie would smile at him, though her own face was pale from sleepless nights. Days passed this way, measured not by the sun or chores, but by small victories, the twitch of a hand, a faint murmur, the flicker of his eyelids. One evening, when the lantern burned low, Ellie sat reading aloud from a tattered book Raoul had found in the cupboard. Her voice was uneven but gentle, wrapping the quiet room in warmth. She finished a passage, looked up, and found Silas watching her. His gaze was heavy, clouded with pain yet steady. "You're awake," she breathed, the words breaking into a smile. He didn't answer at first, only let his eyes follow her as she set the book aside and leaned closer. She brushed the hair back from his forehead, her fingers trembling. "You gave me quite a fright," she whispered. His lips moved, the sound faint, rough like gravel. "Still here?" She laughed through the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Yes, still here." The next day she fed him spoonfuls of warm porridge slowly, patiently. Each time she held the spoon steady until he managed to swallow. She dabbed the corners of his mouth with a cloth, her touch tender, almost reverent. They spoke little, but the silences were no longer empty. They were filled with the weight of things neither dared to name aloud. When he drifted off again, Ellie sat by the bed, resting her head on the edge of the mattress, her hand near his. She didn't notice when his fingers moved until they covered hers. Her breath caught. She looked up, met his eyes, and saw the truth in them unspoken. But certain, he held her hand not tightly, but as if grounding himself to the world through her. Ellie's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm not afraid anymore. Not since I met you." Silas closed his eyes, but his hand tightened just enough to answer. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not only from fear or exhaustion. They were from the quiet bloom of something she had not thought possible again. Hope fragile and fierce. The ranch was scarred. The world outside still dangerous. But in that small room beside that bed she felt a certainty stronger than either. She wasn't running anymore. She was staying. Weeks passed, and with them the wounds of that violent day faded into scars. The door had been mended, the yard cleared of broken boards, the smoke-stained air replaced by the sweet scent of early summer grass. What had once felt fragile now carried the weight of permanence. The ranch was alive again. Tom's laughter rose high across the pasture as he chased after a butterfly, his small boots kicking up dust that sparkled in the sunlight. Raoul leaned against the porch rail, pipe in hand, watching with quiet pride. Near the fence line, Silas worked with a steady rhythm, hammering nails into posts, shoulders strong, though still marked by bruises that had not fully healed. His movements were patient, each strike deliberate, as though rebuilding more than just wood. Ellie came walking across the yard, a bucket of water balanced against her hip. The sun glowed on her hair, and for a moment Silas paused, watching her approach. She smiled faintly, set the bucket down, and handed him the dipper without a word. He drank, handed it back, and their hands lingered together for the briefest second before parting. It was not the grand gestures that defined their days now, but the repetition of small ones, chores shared, meals cooked side by side, laughter echoing off the walls of a once quiet home. These simple acts, once carried out in solitude, now stitched themselves into the fabric of something new. Later, as the sun melted low across the horizon, they stood together on the porch. Tom was still running circles in the field, his voice carrying like a song. Raoul had gone inside, leaving the two of them in the hushed glow of dusk. Ellie rested her hand lightly against Silas's arm. Her voice came soft, almost shy, yet certain. "At first," she whispered, "I only asked to hide beneath your coat." He turned toward her, the fading light brushing his face, eyes steady and searching. "But now," she continued, her gaze holding his. I only want to stand beside you through sun and rain, for the rest of my life. For a long moment there was no sound but the wind moving through the grass. Silas's hand rose, rough palm brushing over hers. He didn't speak, but his grip tightened. And in that silence the promise was made. Together they stepped down into the yard, walking until they reached the edge of the pasture where the wildflowers grew in a sweep of gold and white. They stood side by side, looking out over the field as the evening light spread across it like a blessing. The world was still vast, still harsh beyond the fence. But here, among the blooms and the laughter of a child, their hearts were free, and as the sun sank into the horizon, painting the sky with fire and gold, it felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of a promise kept. And that's the story of a young woman who once begged to hide beneath a stranger's coat, only to discover a home beneath his heart. From terror to bravery, from isolation to love, Ellie and Silas demonstrated that even in the harshest terrain, hope can take root like a wildflower and grow into something unbreakable. If this story touched you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Wild West Echoes for more unforgettable journeys of love, loss, and redemption on the American frontier. Because out here, where the wind carries secrets and the land holds scars, every love story is a legend waiting to be told.